What's going on, family? I'm Scrapbookboxing, Museum of the Forgotten Fisticuffs series. I want to continue to examine 100 years of World Championship fights. I want to take a look at April 12th, 1981. That would be the death of the great Joe Louis. But April 12th, 1989 would also be the death of another great fighter, and his name was Sugar Ray Robinson. So let's go back to the date that these men were born. May 13th, 1914 would be the birth of Joe Louis. May 3rd, 1921 would be the birth of the great Ray Robinson. His name was Walker Smith. Joe Louis's name was Joseph Louis Barrow. Now let's go back to the month of May for one moment. Both men were born in May. But Joe Louis was born on the 13th of May, and Ray Robinson was born on the 3rd of May. What does that mean? It means that Ray Robinson was born 10 days earlier in the month of May than Joe Louis was. So let's set number 10 aside for one moment. Joe Louis was born 1914 and Ray Robinson was born in 1921. What does that mean? It means that Joe Louis was born 7 years earlier than Ray Robinson. Joe Louis had died April 12, 1981. Ray Robinson died April 12, 1989. What does that mean? It means that Joe Louis died 8 years earlier than Ray Robinson. So when you add up 8 and 7, you get 15. And you take away the 10 days that Ray Robinson was born earlier than Joe Louis, and you add it up with 15, you have 25. But what does all this mean? Joe Louis defended his heavyweight championship belt 25 times. Ray Robinson had a boxing ring career as a professional for 25 years. Joe Louis had retired in 1951 when he lost to Rocky Marciano by 8th round stoppage in New York's Madison Square Garden. Ray Robinson became middleweight champion of the world in 1951 when he stopped Jacob LaMotta in Chicago. Now, what does that mean? Joe Louis lost to an Italian heavyweight champion. Ray Robinson defeated an Italian middleweight champion. There are so many parallels between these men's careers, and I wanted to take the time to celebrate and shout out these two men. Now, both these men were born in a small town in the South. Joe Louis was born on the outskirts of Lafayette, Alabama. Ray Robinson was born in the outskirts of Georgia. Joe Louis's name was Joseph Louis Barrow. He was known as the Brown Bomber. He was born May 13th, 1914, and he died April 12th, 1981. Las Vegas, Nevada. He stood 6'1" 3/4 inches, and he weighed 188 to 218 pounds. He was managed by Julian Black and John Roxborough. He was trained by Jack Blackburn and then later Manny Seaman. Ray Robinson was trained by Harry Wiley Sr., Soldier Jones, Pee Wee Beale. He was managed by a young man that was a numbers runner along with Julian Black. And his name was George Gangford. George Gangford was also involved with a lot of great fighters. But Ray Robinson would be the man that would make him the most money. Now, when both these men turned professional, Louis in 34 and Ray Robinson in 1940, it would change the game forever. Because Ray Robinson would become a one-time welterweight, 5-time middleweight champion. Joe Louis was a 25-year reign heavyweight champion. He would have 22 championship fights. Ray Robinson would be a 5-time middleweight champion. Let's talk about that for one moment. Because every champion he defeated for that middleweight championship crown was a Hall of Famer. You had Jacob LaMotta, who was known as the Bronx Bull. In 1939, he would win the light heavyweight championship diamond gloves, which is phenomenal. Because that same year, Ray Robinson would win in 1939 New York Golden Gloves in the featherweight division when he defeated Louis Spider Valentine. Spider Valentine was known all over Harlem. And for Ray Robinson to get that victory in the Golden Gloves meant that he was a superstar. So much so that Spider Valentine skipped 1940 Golden Gloves in a lightweight division. He was supposed to move up as Ray did. But he stayed down to the featherweight division and he would win the 1939 featherweight Golden Gloves. Open class. Didn't take that chance by going up in the lightweight division. Ray Robinson would defeat Annie Nanelli. He would defeat Annie Nanelli in the Chicago Golden Gloves as well as the New York Golden Gloves in the lightweight championship division. Joe Louis would win the AAU and the Chicago National Golden Gloves, 1934. He turned professional and fought a young man by the name of Jack Cracklin. Ray Robinson turned professional. And he fought a Puerto Rican fighter who had some goods about him. His name was Joe Escoveria. He would box part-time. He's a taxi cab driver in the Bronx, New York. But Ray Robinson was on the undercard of the great Henry Armstrong and Fritzy Zivit. And he had his opportunity to show the world what he was made of. As an amateur, Ray Robinson would have 85 amateur fights. Well, he would win 85 amateur fights. And he would knock out 69 of his opponents, 40 in the very first round. He had over 200 professional fights. 132 professional fights that he would win after his first loss in 1943. That would be his 40th fight against Jake LaMotta. Well, he would face Jake LaMotta 3 weeks later, that same year, 1943, and he would defeat Jake LaMotta. In between that time, he would face Jackie Wilson from California. Jackie Wilson would be in the top 10 class in his career. Ray Robinson would fight fighters such as Willie Joyce, Ralph Zanelli, Burt Littell. Joe Louis would fight fighters such as Max Schmeling, Max Baer, Primo Carnera. He would take on Buddy Bear, Tony Two-Ton Colento, Billy Conn twice, Artur Godoy twice. Yes, he would even fight Buddy Bear twice. Ray Robinson would be in a ring with Randy Turpin, 2 different occasions. In the second fight, they would fight in New York's Polo Grounds. That would be one of the most important fights in Ray Robinson's career. Now, this happened in 1951. Now, what's interesting about 1951, for me, that would be the most fascinating year in all of boxing history. Why? Because although 1940 was as compelling, but 1951 showed what a champion Ray Robinson was made of. let's go back for one moment. 1940, you had great fighters such as Willie Pep, Ike Williams, Ezard Charles, Jimmy Bivens, the great Ray Robinson. And I even include Jake LaMotta because he turned professional in 1940, but he had his first fight in 1941. Sidney Walker, Bo Jack, had two fights, 1939, towards the end of that year. But he would really get started in 1940. But what was so interesting about 1951, with the names that I mentioned, Ray Robinson, Ike Williams, Ezard Charles, and Willie Pep, they would become champions but lose their titles in 1951. Ray Robinson would lose his crown to Randy Turpin. Ezard Charles would lose his crown to Jersey Joe Walcott. Willie Pep would lose his crown to Sandy Sadler. Ike Williams would lose his crown to Jimmy Carter. All these men turned professional in 1940. And if you want to include Jake LaMotta as a 1940s fighter, as I do, he lost his crown in 1951 to the great Ray Robinson. The difference between all the men that I just mentioned, Ray Robinson was the only fighter who would regain his crown in 1951. Yes, against Randy Turpin. You see, that night at the Polo Grounds, Randy Turpin came over from England as champion because he had defeated Ray Robinson that same year in 1951 in England. Ray Robinson came back from a world tour, if you will. And Randy Turpin was his 7th professional fight on that tour. And he would defeat Ray Robinson in 15 rounds. You see, Randy Turpin had a grandfather, an old bare-knuckle fighter. And he would show Randy Turpin some moves, tricks of the trade, how to spin your man into the sun. He was a very underrated defensive fighter, was Randy Turpin. And Ray Robinson would have a long talk with Joe Louis because Joe Louis had similar experiences in 1936 with Max Schmeling. But he understood what it would be like to make your... So Joe Louis understood what it would be like to somewhat disappoint the community, if you will. You see, he went through that when he lost to Max Schmeling in 36, although he became champion in 1937 by knocking out James J. Braddock in the 8th round at Comiskey Park in Chicago. He would be the second heavyweight champion of black descent in boxing history. But it wasn't enough for him, because when he lost to Schmeling in 36, Harlem, Detroit, Alabama, many cities were accustomed to honking their horns. They would go home and take a bath and put on a 3-piece suit. Women would wear their Sunday dresses. Joe Louis employed a lot of people because all the shoe shine boys who would be on every corner shining up those shoes, they called it a spit shine. And all the men would go to the cleaners and get their suits out of the cleaners, and the women would get their dresses out of the cleaners as well, and they would go and get their hair done. That was a big event. But they did that only to go home and listen on the radio, because their spirits were lifted by Joe Louis. 1938, Joe Louis had a chance and an opportunity to redeem himself. And Joe Louis would do that very thing. You see, he was smashed with 72 straight right hands in 36. But he smashed Max Schmeling 42 fights worth of punches. break his kidney, rupture his vertebrae. And he explained to Ray Robinson how that felt. So Ray Robinson would go into the polo grounds in that lonely night of 1951. But an incident would happen to Ray Robinson, similar to what happened to him the first time he fought Randy Turpin in England. He would suffer a cut. And Randy Turpin smelled blood. But Ray had a fortunate circumstance happen to him. Had a trainer by the name of Harry Wiley Sr. Now, Harry Wiley Sr. would be the first black trainer to lead the 1932 Olympic Games. He would be responsible for bringing back 5 medals, 2 gold and 3 bronze. Oh, a young man would come out of those games with a bronze medal and become a 2-time bantamweight champion, and his name was Lou Salica. But Harry Wiley Sr. would hand wrap Sam Langford's hands. He would carry the water bucket for Jack Dempsey when he fought for the championship, 1919, Toledo, Ohio. You had Big Bill Tate. You also had a very special fighter. Was Joe Chip. And Joe Chip would tell Harry Wiley Sr., you should become a trainer one day. And Harry Wiley Sr. would take him up on that offer. As a fighter in the YMCA, he'd be involved in a taxi cab accident. Couldn't fight or train anymore. But he remembered those words and he became one of the greatest trainers in all of boxing history. Now, Joe Chip was a younger brother of George Chip, who would become a middleweight champion of the world when he defeated Frank Klaus. But Harry Wiley Sr. would have the highest responsibility by taking on Walker Smith, who was Ray Robinson. Well, that Harry Wiley Sr. would have a conversation with Ruby Goldstein, because Dr. Vincent Nardiotto would walk into the ring, and instead of going to Ray's corner, he went straight to Ruby Goldstein, whispered in his ear, and told him, Ray, I need you to go over and do the things you need to do. Ruby Goldstein took that as a hint. And he walked over to Vincent Nardiotto. And he asked him, what do you mean? Do you want me to stop it? Or he said, Ruby, I need you to go over and talk to Ray. Because if I talk to him the way I should talk to him, I'm going to stop this fight. So Goldstein went back over to Ray Robinson, looked at his eye, and Harry Wiley Sr. cut in front of him and said, Ruby, do me a favor. Give me one more round. Soldier Jones will take care of the cut. This is a championship fight. Ruby Goldstein told him, don't worry about it. Harry, I'll take care of it. I'll give my recommendations to Dr. Nardiotto. And Ray Robinson, like a true champion, would take Randy Turpin to school. He would drop him. He would get up at a certain count of Ruby Goldstein. Ray would take him over to the ropes. And as excited as Ray Robinson was, missed a few punches, but the most important ones landed. Goldstein would stop the fight, and Ray Robinson would once again become a middleweight champion of the world. And he jumped up and down, and he couldn't believe it. And all the things that Joe Louis had told him and explained to him came to fruition. He would get his reputation back, his name back. He would secure his legacy. One of the greatest nights of Ray Robinson's career. And it was shared with a conversation he had with Joe Louis's greatest night of his career. The night that Joe Louis would knock out Max Schmeling. A party was given to Joe Louis as a party was given to Ray Robinson. And Joe Louis would walk across the Willis Avenue Bridge. And he would walk over to the Savoy Manor with his wife Martha. And they would be stomping at the Savoy, as they say. Little Chick Webb, Ella Fitzgerald would make some of the sweetest sounds in Harlem that night. Ray Robinson walk over to his restaurant, and he was treated as a king. Now, I mentioned to you about Ruby Goldstein. He was no stranger to the ring. You see, Ruby Goldstein had a similar night happen to him. Because Ruby Goldstein, the very good lightweight in his day, and the biggest fight that he had was another Jewish fighter. Because in those days, in the 1920s, you didn't have to go to the Polo Grounds. You didn't have to go to Yankee Stadium. You didn't have to go to Madison Square Garden. And the community within itself was almost a championship fight. He took on Sid Terrace, May 1927. And he was knocked out in the first round. Where? At the New York's Polo Grounds. The same place where he would have to make one of his toughest decisions in stopping a fight with Ray Robinson and Randy Turpin. So he understood. But he would also be knocked out by Jimmy McLaurin, December 1929. He would suffer a knockout loss with Ace Hutkins, June 1926. Hutkins was known as the Nebraskan Wildcat. But as a referee, he would referee fights such as Ray Robinson and Joey Maxim, Floyd Patterson and Ingemar Johansson, Benny Kid Perrette, Amo Griffith. 1962, their third fight. He would suffer a ridicule. He would have to go down to the State Athletic Commission and explain his role in that fight. Had the pleasure of meeting Ruby Goldstein, as I had the pleasure of meeting Ray Robinson. Had the pleasure of meeting Jake LaMotta. Never met Turpin, he passed away. Never met Joe Louis, and I regret it till this day. Met Henry Armstrong, Emil Griffith. And the list goes on and on. But Ruby Goldstein, who I met from a friend by the name of Teddy, they both lived on Cherry Street in the Lower East Side of Manhattan. Had the opportunity to ask Goldstein about that fight. And he told me Ray Robinson was the greatest fighter that he had an opportunity to referee. He said he saw them all. Joe Louis was the greatest fighter as a heavyweight that he's ever seen. Ray Robinson was the greatest fighter, middleweight and welterweight, that he's ever seen. I asked him about Sam Langford, all that he heard of Sam Langford. he told me Sam Langford could have been the best fighter of all times based on his legacy and his resume. But he said he saw Ray Robinson. He refereed Ray Robinson's fights, watched them in the gym. Couldn't think of another fighter had those skills while he was alive to see him. So when you look at these men's careers, when you look at Joe Louis's career, you break his career down, fight by fight, circumstance by circumstance. When you look at all what he had to offer, I mean, that's not many things that can be said on the negative side of Joe Louis. 22 opponents, 20 by knockout, World Heavyweight Championship fights. He had a record of 27-1 with 23 knockouts in world title fights. He was 10-3 with 9 knockouts against former, current, and future world champions. He was in the ring with fighters such as Max Schmeling and Primo Carnera, John Henry Lewis, and Max Baer, Jersey Joe Walcott twice, Billy Conn twice, Jack Sharkey. The only men that he lost to would be Max Schmeling in 36, Ezzard Charles in 1950, and Rocky Marciano in 1951. Now, when he faced Ezzard Charles, Charles had defeated Jersey Joe Walcott in 1949. And he would become the third black heavyweight champion in boxing history. I'm speaking of Ezzard Charles. But although he was a champion of one, he wasn't a champion of all. You see, he defeated Jersey Joe Walcott for the NBA version of the heavyweight championship title. It wasn't fully recognized because Lisa Void was recognized by the British Boxing Board of Control, as well as Ring in New York, SAC. Joe Louis would defeat Lisa Void. And since Ezzard Charles had defeated Joe Louis, it wasn't until then Ezzard Charles was now considered the world heavyweight champion. And that was just in time for Jersey Joe Walcott, who, when he faced Joe Louis in 1947 and 1948, it was a controversial loss for Walcott against Louis in 1947. And Ruby Goldstein was the referee for that fight. He told Joe Louis to hang it up. Once again, Joe Louis couldn't suffer a loss like that. He had too much pride, and remember what his mother told him on the porch. If you're going to get into this thing, give it all your thoughts and give it everything you have. Don't disappoint you or your people. Similar speech he got in 1938. Well, in 1948, Joe Louis would face Jersey Joe Walcott once again. And this time he would knock him out in the 10th round. So Joe Walcott would get another opportunity against Ezzard Charles in 49. And Ezzard Charles would defeat Joe Walcott, and he would become the heavyweight champion according to the NBA. So now Joe Walcott would get his shot against Ezzard Charles once again in 1941, and he would knock out Ezzard Charles, and he would become the second black heavyweight champion that Jack Blackburn would create. Because Jack Blackburn, who was a trainer of Joe Louis, first trained Joe Walcott. Walcott couldn't commit to training because he had a family that he needed to feed. And Jack Blackburn knew of only one of the two fighters that he trained to become heavyweight champion, because Jack Blackburn had died in 1942 while Joe Louis was in the war. He knew of one, he didn't know of two black fighters that he trained that would become heavyweight champion of the world. Very interesting. So Joe Louis, fascinating fighter. He was named Ring Fighter of the Year, 1936, 38, 39, and 41. Never had a draw in 69 bouts. He played a movie called Spirit of Youth, betrayed himself. He was some fighter. His last night would be on a night. Larry Holmes, Trevor Burbick. That's when he would pass away. Joe would be entered in the Boxing Hall of Fame, 1954, 1950. He would end his career with a record of 69 fights, 66 wins, 52 knockouts, and 3 losses. Ray would end his career with a record of 202 fights, 173 wins, 108 knockouts, 19 losses, 6 draws, and 2 no contests. What a fighter these men were. He would fight the likes of Henry Armstrong and Paul Pender, Carmen Basilio, Fritzy Zivic, Sammy Engott, Marty Servo, Jake LaMotta, Gene Former, Terry Downs, and Randy Turpin, Bobby Dykes, Ralph Tiger Jones, Jackie Wilson, Artie Levine, just to name a few. Scrapbook Boxing, Museum of the Forgotten Fisticuffs series. All great fights and all great fighters will never be forgotten on my channel. I want to salute Ray Robinson and Joe Louis. 100 years of World Championship fights. April 12th, 1981. April 12th, 1989. Salute.
Stop those.